The 1950s are often regarded as the golden age of the American automobile. Fueled by a post-war economic boom, cars went from plain and modest to flashy and futuristic, with fins, tritone paint, and lots of chrome. And before these space-age-like styling elements found their way to the showroom floor, the buying public was getting warmed up by ever more radical concept cars. The car makers didn't sell you a car, they sold you a dream. Welcome everyone to episode 66 of the Automotive History series, where we're going to take a closer look at the American dream cars of the 1950s. This is going to be a 4-part episode, and this is part 3, the Chrysler Idea Car Edition. It's interesting to see that of all the rivaling car companies, Chrysler was actually quite quick to react when GM surprised the world in 1938 with the release of the Buick Wide-Job concept car. See part 1 of this episode. And why is it so interesting? Well, one could argue that Chrysler was even earlier than GM in releasing a radical and revolutionary car. But Chrysler didn't release it as a concept car just to show off, but as an actual regular production model, the Chrysler Airflow from 1934. The Airflow was quite ahead of its time in terms of styling, fully embracing the aerodynamic look when other cars just started to adopt it by various bits and pieces. But the car was deemed too radical by the buying public and sales were slow. People just weren't ready to be introduced to so many new features and far-out styling. And that's why you make a one-off concept car after all, to simply gauge reaction and see what sticks. So, with the Airflow fiasco behind us, Chrysler became very careful and conservative in the next decade when it came to car styling. Chrysler cars didn't look too bad, but they weren't certainly ahead of the curve either. And so it's surprising to see that Chrysler, of all car makers, was quick to react when rivaling GM launched the Buick Wide-Job in 1938. Only 3 years later, by the start of the 1940s, Chrysler released not one, but 2 show cars. The Chrysler Newport Phaeton in 1940 and the Chrysler Thunderbolt in 1941. I'll start with the Newport Phaeton, as it wasn't really a concept car, but a show car nonetheless. Instead of one example, 5 of these were eventually produced. The Newport Phaeton was a so-called dual-cowl open car, so it essentially had 2 interiors, separating the driver from the rear passengers. The car just looks like it was used personally by Scrooge McDuck, but other than that, the styling was quite modern for its day, with full envelope or pontoon styling, front fenders that flow smoothly into the rear fenders, much like the post-war Buicks, and hidden headlights, uncommon but not unusual. The Newports were mostly used for official events, like parades and such, and were one way to show off Chrysler's achievements to the general public. The Newports were quickly joined by another styling masterpiece, albeit a bit more radical, the Chrysler Thunderbolt. This time, 6 of these were made. Now, let's compare the Thunderbolt to the Buick Wide-Job. I consider the Thunderbolt to be even more radical than the Wide-Job. We're looking at a very, very smooth design, with once again full envelope or pontoon styling, and no hint of fenders in the body sculpting, but smooth lines, better known as the bathtub style. What also adds to the smoothness of the design are the front wheels that also have fender skirts, giving the car a floating appearance. The hidden headlights, and get this, a bottom breather. The air inlets are positioned below the front bumper, still providing air to cool down the engine, but also allowing the front end to be completely smooth without any form of conventional chrome grille. You'd think that these 2 cars Chrysler was on fast track to dominate the car industry in terms of concept car styling, but as you may know, a Second World War put an end to these ambitions. By the start of the 1950s, Chrysler faced a problem. They were last in styling class, thanks to an overly conservative upper management. Most Chrysler designs were seen as tall, boxy, uninspiring, and dull, and this had to change. In order to do that, Chrysler hired talented car designer Virgil Exner in 1949 in an effort to turn the sinking ship around. Just around the time General Motors started to make noises about making a successor to the Wide-Job, Chrysler and Exner came up with a similar approach. And here is where it gets interesting. When it comes to concept car styling, both GM and Ford took a futurist approach. Their concept cars would show what the future would hold and what would come to regular production cars in the coming years. But Chrysler's management, even before hiring Virgil Exner, decided to take a different approach, which was elegance. European elegance. That's right, Chrysler Big Boss K.T. Teller had a soft spot for European elegance and Italian design in particular. Teller carried out an order to give an otherwise plain Plymouth an exciting and elegant European redesign, an Italian tune-up. Teller invited 2 Italian coach builders to take part in this, and both came with their own design. These were Pininfarina with their styling proposal for a plain Plymouth, note the overall European stance and looks, fastback styling and the sweeping window design that cuts deep into the C-pillar, and Ghia that came up with a more reserved styling proposal, but one that came with a dominant grille. Chrysler ultimately chose Ghia's design over Pininfarina, probably because they liked it more, but more likely because the design costed less, and by 1951 Chrysler unveiled the Plymouth XX-500 Ghia show car. I'm just mesmerized by the fact it looks so convincingly European, but I can't seem to find out what makes it look so European. There are some traces of early 1950s Ferraris in there, and somehow it also looks a bit British, but I can't really name any British car that it reminds me of. Anyway, around this time, Virgil Exner worked himself up the corporate ladder of the design department and caught wind of the Italian tune-up that was going on. He liked it so much that he also went to work to create his own version of this new automotive Goodfellas recipe, and in the same year, in 1951, Chrysler also released the Chrysler K-310. So, the Chrysler K-310. I mean, what's not to like? Look at the graceful, elegant lines broken up by bold styling elements like the powerful and bulging hood and chrome grille that even extends below the front bumper. The front nose is visually pushed even more forward thanks to its deeply recessed headlights. None of that fender skirt nonsense, but open wheel wells with white wall all-spoke wheels for that sporty look. The rear is clean and simple, with freestanding taillights that add a touch of futurism. The only thing that spoils it a bit is the fake rear tire hump. It's one of Virgil Exner's many trump cards. It's a subtle reference to old continental style cars from Europe, but often joke that it looks like a toilet seat. With the release of the Plymouth XX-500 and the Chrysler K-310 in 1951, it was pretty clear that Chrysler was heading in a different direction when it comes to concept car styling. If GM and Ford were all about futurism, Chrysler was all about elegance. And where GM and especially Ford made cars that didn't make any sense and usually came without any engine or working components, better known as pushmobiles, the Chrysler concept cars were built in such a way that they were very easy to be made ready for regular production. In fact, during the 1950s, Chrysler came more than once very close to putting some of these models into production, but ultimately chose not to do it, probably because of financial fear. So, in short, we have a laboratory on wheels made by Ford, a rocket ship on wheels made by GM, and chicken parmesan on wheels made by Chrysler, although they nicknamed them idea cars. Just a styling idea or a suggestion of what might come in the future. Another thing that sets Chrysler apart from the rest is that of all the concept cars Chrysler made throughout the 50s, it seems that most attention was placed on the budget-friendly Plymouth division and the semi-luxurious Chrysler division. Divisions like DeSoto and Dodge would also get their own concept cars, but just not as much as the other divisions. Imperial, what would become a separate luxury division in the mid-50s, was yet to be set up by Chrysler, so no concept cars were made for Imperial. When you look at the Chrysler concept cars of the first half of the 50s, you see the European elegance in their design is strong, but what you also see is a styling evolution instead of completely different concept cars each year. After the XX-500 and the K-310, Chrysler made a deal with Ghia. From here on out, Ghia would become a close industry partner for Chrysler. Chrysler would design the cars and Ghia would build them. Much of the idea cars were also nicknamed the Ghia cars. By 1952, Chrysler released 2 new idea cars, the Chrysler C200, which was essentially a convertible version of the K310 from last year, and the Chrysler Special, in my eyes an evolution of the styling of the K310. The Chrysler Special. Behold a car that I regard as drop-dead gorgeous. The only thing that is slightly off is the massive grille, but other than that, this car could have gone straight into production. It's so elegant and sporty. This could have been a full-on European GT car, a Grand Tourer, like some early 50s British or Italian sports cars, like the French Ford Comet. It's so smooth and sleek. A year later, Chrysler released 3 new idea cars. Around this time, Virgil Exner really stepped into the picture and tried to introduce his ideas for the styling for these cars. Both Dodge and DeSoto were given their own concept cars that followed a similar pattern as with Chrysler. Dodge was given the Firearrow, and every new year a new generation of the Firearrow would come out. The Dodge Firearrow for 1953 was Chrysler's version of the emerging sports car theme, also common over at the other brands, such as GM with the Pontiac Club de Mer. Both cars are wide, low, and a convertible. DeSoto was given a more or less reworked version of the Chrysler Ghia concept car, having similar lines. The rear-end styling reminds me heavily of the Mercedes Gullwing from the mid-50s. But the next year, the Adventurer 2 was more in line with the Dodge Firearrow, featuring a more radical flying saucer-like styling. Chrysler in the meantime revealed the Chrysler elegance. It's once again an updated version of the K-310, now looking even more aggressive and muscular. I think of it as one of the most influential idea cars. Quite a few design elements on the car found their way on other Chrysler cars in the future. The overall shape of the grille found its way over on the 1957 Chrysler 300 leather series, and with a bit of an imagination one could argue that the way the recessed headlights are designed might have inspired Ford with the 1967 Mustang styling update. The fake spare tire hump was found on many late 50s Chrysler products, and the freestanding tail light units returned on the 1955 Imperials. And yet, some of you might scream at your screens right now that you recognize the body lines of the elegance. Most notably the body line that sweeps up and forms the flowing rear fenders. Well, the elegance car never went into production, but Ghia reused the body design for the 1955 Karmann Ghia, a small sports car for Volkswagen. The designers that worked on the elegance were the same designers that worked on the Karmann. As it turns out, Virgil Exner later said that he was very much pleased that the design found its way into the real world for people to actually enjoy, and considers the Karmann Ghia as the sincerest form of flattery. So, if you wanted a piece of Italian-American car magic, you bought a German. 1954 was another wild year for Chrysler. This time no idea cars for Chrysler as a brand, but Plymouth, Dodge and DeSoto were given a show car. As I mentioned before, for Dodge and DeSoto it was a continuation of their Firearrow and Adventurer lines. Chrysler presented a sporty trio, starting with the Plymouth Explorer Special. It certainly has traces of Euro-Italian sports scoop styling, especially when you look at the greenhouse design, but new is the addition of a subtle rocket motif on the side. The front end is unusual to say the least. 2 round headlights that are recessed in the body with a massive gaping mushroom-shaped grille in the middle. It looks almost neoclassical, like the mid-70s Chrysler Cordoba, although the Explorer Special did not come with fine Corinthian leather. Dodge presented the Firearrow 3, a car with somewhat similar styling themes, and the front end is also dominated by a massive concave chrome grille. The design of the greenhouse is roughly the same as the Plymouth version. And last, the DeSoto Adventurer 2. This one looks even more like a flying saucer that is actually flying while standing still, and that's some next level design trickery right here, making a car that looks like it's moving while standing still. It is an extremely pronounced forward hunch. Interesting details are the lack of a front bumper and an overall rear styling that seems to be inspired by the Ford X100 concept car from a few years before. I wonder what happened there. In 1956, you see a big shift in focus of styling of these cars. By this time, Exner started his first attempts to change the design language and adopt futuristic styling, eventually known as the forward look. This was also the time when Chrysler's regular production cars experienced a massive metamorphosis. Chrysler presented 3 cars that year. Chrysler would have loved to show you their new Norseman concept car, but that thing is on the bottom of the sea. No, really. The concept car was transported on a ship from Italy to the US until another ship crashed into it due to heavy fog. The ship and the Norseman sunk, and the car was never recovered. Another concept car that was actually safe and dry was the Chrysler Dart, although there were plans to also put that car on the same ship as the Norseman. Here is where you see a big shift from continental elegance to American futurism. Although very smooth and aerodynamic, the Dart was modeled after hydroplanes, very fast motorboats with an aircraft-like design. The car featured an unusual front. Headlights were placed in the grille, something that would become popular by the start of the 60s, but the grille is a narrow oval shape, surrounded by chrome strips that also make up the bumper and curves around the entire body in a continuous unbroken line. On the rear, we find massive fins. According to Exner and Chrysler, fins were the way of the future and helped to stabilize the car, much like those on a hydroplane. Since the car could run, was very powerful thanks to extremely low drag coefficient and powerful engine, the car reached speeds where huge fins on the back would actually improve stability. Especially when you look at the side of the car, notice how the fins are just as tall as the roof of the car. The last car Chrysler presented that year is one that jumped into the emerging high-styled station wagon trend, introducing the Plymouth Plainsman. Interestingly, the Plainsman was presented with a Wild West theme. You'd find several Longhorn logos on the exterior of the car, and inside you were treated on leather seats with cowhide inserts. Styling-wise, the car featured styling elements you already find on the latest Plymouths, especially the hooded headlights. But oddly enough, the total package looks like it could have come from the Ford Motor Company. From the front, the Plainsman looks an awful lot similar like the Ford X100 concept car and some other concept cars made by Mercury and Lincoln. And the overall design of the roof seems like it came from a late 50s Lincoln or Thunderbird, but turned the other way around. According to the stories, by the closing years of the 1950s, Chrysler was hit with import tariffs, and since it shipped most of its show cars from Italy, it was decided to put the Ghia-built cars on the back burner. And as a result, Chrysler was concept car quiet in the last few years of the 1950s. In 1958, Chrysler made two new concept cars, the Plymouth Cabana and the Chrysler Imperial Elegance. But both these cars were more like a designer's playground. They were models to explore various design themes, but never made it out of the styling studios and were never shown to the public. Both the cars show numerous design elements that would find their way over at Chrysler cars of the early 1960s. But you know, my dinner is getting cold right now, so I will not go over every detail, but invite you to take a good look at these design studies and see what made it to production and what didn't. The last thing I want to talk about is, much like General Motors was working on a gas turbine-powered car for the future and showed off its engineering achievements through the radical Firebird concept cars, Chrysler also worked on a turbine car program and decided to try and also grab the attention by working on their own concept car, the Chrysler Turboflight. Finally, we're looking at an over-the-top and bizarre space-age vehicle. It's Virgil Exner's personal vehicular wet dream. There is a lot to unpack, like the headlights, integrated in a very sharp V-shaped grille, the extremely low greenhouse and the sweeping C-pillar, and the dual fins on the back with a deceleration flap in between. This car, along with a Chrysler turbine car that went into limited production, marks the end of a decade full of Chrysler styling under the tail fins, wings of Virgil Exner. He retired in 1962, and Chrysler would roll into the 60s with some concept cars here and there, but not as wild or elegant as the 1950s.